Son asked me and his stepdad, who cared for him all his life, to have minimal involvement in his upcoming wedding, and insisted his bio-dad, who I had to get a restraining order against, would be attending his wedding as blood is thicker than water. But now almost all the relatives are refusing to attend the wedding because of the same reason, and Son thinks we are responsible for this. I have a 27-year-old son named Tobias. Tobias was born during my first marriage to a man named Ronnie. That relationship, unfortunately, was deeply toxic and left scars that I still carry to this day. To be completely honest, Ronnie was abusive, and while it's hard for me to revisit that part of my life, I feel it's important to acknowledge what I went through. No woman should ever have to endure what I experienced during that time. When I first met Ronnie, he seemed perfect. He was sweet, attentive, and full of charm. He knew exactly how to make me feel special, and for a time, I truly believed I had found someone who would cherish me. But everything changed after I became pregnant with Tobias. What started as a whirlwind romance quickly turned into a nightmare. We had a rushed wedding, and almost immediately afterward, Ronnie began to show a side of himself that I had never seen before. At first, his behavior seemed like a concern for me. He wanted to know where I was and what I was doing at all times, and he framed it as him worrying about me and our baby. But soon, his concern turned into controlling me. He would have a problem with me no matter where I went. He didn't trust me even when I gave him no reason not to. Slowly, he isolated me from my close friends who were my only support system. He discouraged me from seeing anyone, and over time, he made it so difficult that I stopped trying altogether. Then he started pressuring me to leave my job. He insisted that working as a pregnant woman was too risky for the baby, even though there was no basis for his claim. He assured me that he would take care of me and that I didn't need to worry about anything. I foolishly believed him and gave up my job. Looking back, I realized how calculated it all was. By cutting off my financial independence, Ronnie ensured that I was completely reliant on him. He wanted to strip me of my autonomy bit by bit until there was nothing left. At first, he would give me small allowances, usually around $50 to cover groceries or any personal needs. It wasn't much, but I made do because I didn't want to upset him. However, even that small allowance eventually stopped. He started accusing me of buying unnecessary things and wasting his money as though I wasn't entitled to even the basic necessities in life. Being pregnant is a vulnerable time for any woman, and cravings are a normal part of the experience. But whenever I mentioned wanting something, a particular food or even just a small treat, Ronnie would brush it off. He refused to buy me anything, claiming that my cravings were childish and immature. It was humiliating and degrading to constantly beg for essentials, only to be dismissed or criticized. The later months of my pregnancy was some of the hardest. My body was exhausted. My legs ached constantly, and even moving around the house became a struggle. I could barely stand on my feet for long, let alone cook meals or clean the house. Instead of understanding or offering help, Ronnie became more abusive. He would literally demand that I continue to cater to his needs, no matter how much pain or fatigue I was experiencing. He would tell me how I was just sitting on the couch and doing nothing the whole day, so the least I could do was cater to him no matter what. On days when I couldn't keep up, his anger would boil over. He would yell at me, calling me a bad wife and accusing me of being lazy and ungrateful. He would threaten to kick me out onto the streets in the cold, saying I had better step up or I'd be left with nothing. Those threats were terrifying because I knew how dependent I had become on him after the pregnancy. Whenever I broke down and cried, pleading with him to understand how hard things were for me, he would lash out physically, punching me in the face or shoving my face to the walls. He'd tell me that being pregnant didn't make me special, that I wasn't some queen deserving of sympathy and I needed to stop acting like a baby. In those moments, I felt utterly dehumanized. I was carrying his child, enduring the physical and emotional toll of pregnancy, and yet he treated me as though I was nothing more than an inconvenience. The fear, the humiliation, and the pain all compounded into a suffocating sense of hopelessness. Every day felt like a battle for survival. My only hope was that once Tobias was born, maybe things could somehow change. Looking back now, I realized how trapped I was and how much strength it took just to endure those days. To be honest, if I had a supportive family, I wouldn't have stayed with Ronnie for as long as I did. I would have packed my bags and left the moment things started going downhill, but life didn't give me that option. My mom had passed away years earlier and my dad was a drug addict, someone who only reached out to me when he needed any money. He was a leech, plain and simple, and never someone I could rely on for help or support. Beyond that, I didn't have any close relatives who could offer me a lifeline. I was out of a job, pregnant, not to leave alone. So staying with Ronnie felt like the only choice I had, as terrible as it was. When Tobias was born, I hoped, just maybe, Ronnie would change. I prayed constantly that becoming a father would soften him, that he'd see his son and realize the joy and responsibility of raising a child. But abusive men seldom change, and Ronnie was no exception. Ronnie made it painfully clear that he had no interest in being a dad. He couldn't even bring himself to hold Tobias for longer than 5 minutes. He didn't change a single diaper, didn't stay up during sleepless nights, and never comforted him when he cried. Every little task that came with having a newborn fell on my shoulders and I bore it all alone. It was as though Tobias didn't have two parents. He had just me. I took care of Tobias through every sleepless night, every feeding, every moment of exhaustion and worry. And despite how hard it was, I loved him fiercely. He was my reason to keep going. In the middle of my darkest days, he was my light. As Tobias got older, I realized that staying with Ronnie was dangerous. I couldn't continue to raise my son in an environment filled with anger, neglect, and abuse. I've decided that the only way to move forward was to regain my independence. As soon as Tobias was old enough, I went back to work. Finding a job was no small feat after years of being out of the workforce, but I was determined. With every paycheck I began to secretly save, hoping to finally have enough money to leave Ronnie for good. It became an ultimate goal, breaking free from him so Tobias and I could have a chance at a better life. Meanwhile, Ronnie's abusive behavior towards me never changed. He continued to treat me with the same cruelty, and every day, I lived in fear, not just for myself, but for my son. The thought of his anger spilling over onto Tobias haunted me constantly. I did everything in my power to shield my son constantly, but despite my efforts, the day I dreaded the most eventually came. Tobias was just 6 years old when it happened. I was in our backyard teaching him how to ride a bicycle. It was a slow process, as most things are with children, and Tobias kept falling as he tried to find his balance. I remember encouraging him gently, telling him it was okay to fall and that he was doing great. Ronnie, however, had been watching us, and his patience quickly ran thin. He started yelling at Tobias from across the yard, berating him for falling over and over. Tobias looked so scared, but before I could even intervene, Ronnie stormed over. He grabbed Tobias roughly by his shoulder and shook him hard, yelling at his ears as if that would somehow make him a better cyclist. Tobias was terrified, so much so that he wet his pants right there. That moment seemed to push Ronnie over the edge. Instead of realizing how frightened our son was, Ronnie became even angrier. He slapped Tobias across the face hard. The sound of that slap was like a dagger to my heart. Tobias burst into tears, and I could see the fear and confusion in his little eyes. I didn't think. I just acted. I pushed Ronnie aside and pulled Tobias into my arms, holding him close and whispering to him that he was safe, that I wouldn't let anything else happen to him. But Ronnie wasn't done. He started punching and kicking me, landing blows on my back as he shouted vile things. He called me an incompetent and soft mother and blamed me for why Tobias couldn't ride a bike yet, as if it was some grand failure on my part. That night, after what had happened in the backyard, my body was covered in bruises. I looked at myself in the mirror and knew I couldn't hide my bruises anymore. I was terrified of going to work the next day, afraid of how my coworkers might react if they noticed the marks on my skin. But that fear paled in comparison to the overwhelming realization that hit me. I couldn't live like this anymore. I didn't want to spend another day terrified, humiliated, and broken, not for myself and certainly not for Tobias. That night, I made a decision. I was done. I was going to leave Ronnie no matter the cost. The next morning, while Ronnie was at work, I quickly packed up whatever I could fit into a few bags. I made sure to gather Tobias' essentials too as quietly as possible so I wouldn't raise suspicion with the neighbors. My heart was pounding the entire time. Before leaving, I left Ronnie a note. It was short and to the point. I told him I was done with our marriage, I couldn't live like this anymore, and that I wanted a divorce. Then, with Tobias holding my hand, I walked out the door. We went to a nearby motel just far enough to feel some distance from Ronnie, but close enough that I could figure out my next steps. As soon as we got to the room, I turned off my phone. I knew Ronnie would be furious when he came back home to find us gone, and he would start to call and text me in anger. I wasn't prepared to face his anger just yet. That night, for the first time in years, Tobias and I slept peacefully at the motel. There was no yelling, no fear, no chaos, just peaceful silence. It was the first glimpse of the life I wanted for us, a life free from Ronnie's control. Lying there in that motel room, I felt even more sure that leaving my ex was the right decision. The next morning, I made the mistake of turning my phone back on, and as soon as I did, it was flooded with hundreds of messages and voicemails from Ronnie. Each one was more vile and threatening than the last. He cussed me out, calling me every horrible name he could think of. He said he would kill me, that I was a worthless excuse for a wife and mother, and that he would take Tobias away from me. The messages sent chills down my spine, but I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I needed to be strong. What I didn't know was that Ronnie had been keeping an even tighter grip on me than I realized. At some point during our marriage, he had secretly shared my phone's location with his device. I had no idea that he'd been tracking me at all times. When I turned on my phone's location services that morning, I unknowingly made it easier for him to pinpoint where I was, and that's how he found me at the motel and immediately came over to confront me. When I saw him standing outside the door, my stomach dropped. The terror I felt at that moment was indescribable. He banged on the door, screaming at the top of his lungs and threatening to break it down if I didn't let him in. The chaos he was causing was so loud that I felt I had no choice but to open the door, hoping to de-escalate the situation. As soon as I did, he stormed in and started kicking and punching me relentlessly. I fell to the floor crying and begging him to leave me alone. But he didn't stop. Tobias, hearing the commotion, ran over to try to protect me. My sweet boy, only 6 years old, came crying to my side, begging Ronnie to stop hurting me. But Ronnie's anger turned towards Tobias. He kicked him and yelled at him for interfering with us. Seeing him hurt my son like that gave me the strength to push past the fear. I immediately grabbed Tobias and ran to the washroom, locking the door behind us. Inside, I held Tobias close, trying to comfort him while my mind raced. I was terrified Ronnie would break down the door, but I knew I had to act fast. I dialed 911, my hands trembling as I explained what was happening. Hearing Ronnie shouting outside the bathroom, still threatening to kill both of us, was horrifying, but the dispatcher assured me that help was on the way. When the police arrived, Ronnie was finally arrested. Even as they were taking him away, he kept shouting that he would kill me and Tobias once he got out. His words sent chills down my spine, but I knew this was my moment to break free. I couldn't let fear paralyze me anymore. That week, I filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order against Ronnie. I hoped that this would finally put an end to his reign of terror, but to my dismay, he wasn't sentenced to prison despite everything he had done. He was released with no real consequences for his actions, which only reinforced my fear of how the justice system often fails survivors of abuse. During the divorce proceedings, Ronnie did everything in his power to drag things out and make the process as difficult as possible. But after months of fighting, I was finally free. Once the divorce was finalized, I made a decision to leave the city entirely. I wanted to start over, far away from the memories of that traumatic chapter. Tobias and I packed up and moved to a new place where we could rebuild our lives. With the restraining order we had against Ronnie, I knew he could not trouble us anymore. Over the years, life slowly began to improve. I met my second husband, Henry, a kind and compassionate man who showed me what love and respect truly look like. Henry has been a blessing in our lives. He not only supported me through my healing journey, but also stepped into the role of a father for Tobias without hesitation. He treated Tobias as his own son, giving him the love and stability that Ronnie never could. When Tobias went to college, Henry was there every step of the way to help support him. He helped pay for Tobias' semester fees and covered other expenses to ensure he could focus on his studies without financial stress. When Tobias mentioned he wanted a car, Henry surprised him with one as a Christmas gift. And when Tobias needed an apartment after graduation, Henry didn't hesitate to help him find one and even pay the first 6 months of rent so that Tobias could save up and get a good start in life. Henry has always been the kind of man who quietly goes above and beyond for those he loves, and Tobias was no exception. Whenever Tobias needed anything, Henry was there without question or hesitation. This is why when Tobias informed us this week that he was getting married to his partner, Henry and I were overjoyed. We were thrilled at the thought of celebrating such a significant moment in his life. But our excitement quickly turned into shock when Tobias dropped a bombshell. He planned to invite his biological father, Ronnie, to the wedding. Hearing this was like a gut punch. In an instant, all the horrible memories of my past with Ronnie came flooding back. The abuse, the fear, the pain. I had no idea Tobias had even been in contact with Ronnie. I was stunned and asked him to explain. And that's when Tobias told me that about a year ago, he had tracked Ronnie down and met up with him. He explained that he had always had lingering questions about his father and wanted to get to know him. I struggled to process what I was hearing. I reminded Tobias that I had always been open with him about Ronnie whenever he had asked me any questions. I never sugarcoated the truth, and I never tried to hide anything from him. I asked my son, "What more did you need to know from him? Why did you feel the need to go to him directly after everything I've already told you?" My voice was trembling, a mix of confusion, hurt, and a little anger. After all, Henry had been the father figure in Tobias's life. He had stepped up when Ronnie never did. Tobias seemed taken aback by my reaction. He told me he just felt a deep need to know more about his origins and understand his biological father despite everything he knew about Ronnie's past. While I could understand his curiosity on some level, it felt like a betrayal. And now Tobias wanted to bring this man into what should be a joyful celebration of love and family. I couldn't fathom sitting in a room with a man who had abused me for years and hurt Tobias when he was just a little boy. I felt heartbroken and conflicted. Tobias told me he wanted to see for himself if Ronnie was really as bad as I had always described him. He admitted that his memories of childhood were fragmented, bits and pieces he could recall, but that much of what he knew about Ronnie came from me. It felt like he was questioning my truth. The years of suffering I had endured as though my words weren't enough. My son went on to say that despite everything Ronnie had done to me, he wanted to give his biological father a chance. Over the past year, Tobias explained he had been getting to know Ronnie and had even grown to enjoy spending time with him. According to Tobias, Ronnie had changed and seemed like a nice man now. I looked at my son in disbelief and anger. Then, Tobias delivered the part that crushed both Henry and me. He informed us that not only was Ronnie invited to the wedding, but that he planned to introduce him to everyone as his real father. Tobias clarified that he didn't see Henry, the man who had stepped in and raised him and supported him in every way, as his true dad. Instead, Ronnie, the man who had abandoned and abused us, was to be given that title. I looked over at Henry and saw his face crumble. It was as if Tobias had ripped the rug out from under him, dismissing years of love and sacrifice with a single sentence. Henry didn't say a word, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He had never treated Tobias as anything less than his own son, and now he was being completely sidelined for Ronnie. As for me, I was devastated. The fact that my own son was willingly inviting Ronnie, my abuser, back into our lives was incomprehensible. I couldn't understand how he could disregard everything I had gone through, everything Ronnie had put both of us through. Did my pain mean so little to him? Did Henry's love and care mean so little compared to Ronnie's DNA? I couldn't help but ask Tobias why he was doing this, why he was tearing apart the family that had stood by him all these years. His answer was like a slap in the face. "Ron is my biological dad," he said. "After all, blood is thicker than water, Mom." It was hard to believe the words were coming out of my son's mouth. Tobias even went as far as to tell us that if we didn't like his decision, then he wanted us to have minimal involvement with his wedding because his mind was already made up. His decision really hurts after everything we had been through together. After all the sacrifices we made for him, Tobias was choosing to put Ronnie at the center of one of the most important days of his life. Since then, both Henry and I feel extremely upset and sad. However, Tobias now feels that we are not being supportive enough of his decision. AITA. For those wondering about the restraining order against Ronnie, yes, it has expired by now. When I left Ronnie all those years ago, I not only got the restraining order, but also moved to an entirely new city. I thought I had done enough to protect myself and Tobias. For a long time, I believed we were safe. I never imagined that Ronnie would re-enter our lives, not through force, but through an invitation from Tobias himself. It's utterly heartbreaking to think about this. The very man who caused so much harm, not just to me, but to Tobias as well, is now being willingly welcomed back into our son's life. Tobias believes that Ronnie has changed, but I know better. Abusers rarely, if ever, change. They only get better at masking their true nature. It terrifies me to think of the manipulation and charm Ronnie may have used to win Tobias over. And worse, it hurts deeply that Tobias seems to be overlooking or dismissing the pain we both endured because of Ronnie all those years ago. Henry, understandably, has been devastated ever since Tobias referred to Ronnie as his real dad. Yes, Ronnie is his biological father. That's a fact we can't change. But Henry has been the one to love, nurture and raise Tobias as his own all these years. He never once treated Tobias any differently, even though he isn't his biological father. Henry was the one who paid for his college, bought him a car, helped him find and fund his first apartment, and supported him in every way a father could. For Tobias to diminish all of that has left us both reeling. What's even harder is how this was all sprung on us out of nowhere. There was no conversation, no warning beforehand. Just a shocking announcement that Ronnie had been in Tobias' life for a year and would be invited to the wedding as his real father. Tobias' declaration that blood is thicker than water felt like a slap in the face. Also, erasing the years of love, care, and stability that Henry and I have worked so hard to provide. Honestly, right now, I'm torn between wanting to support Tobias on his big day and feeling deeply betrayed by his decision. The fact that he wants us to take a back seat in the wedding while Ronnie is given a central role is difficult to stomach. It's as though Tobias is undermining our role in his life, leaving out the sacrifices Henry and I made to give him a better life. After days of difficult conversations and sleepless nights, Henry and I came to a decision. We would not be attending Tobias' wedding. It wasn't a choice we made lightly. Both of us felt that being in the same space as Ronnie, the man who had caused so much pain and trauma in my life, would be unbearable. We also couldn't reconcile the way Tobias had disregarded Henry's role in his life, all while elevating Ronnie to the position of his real father. It simply hurt too much. When we informed Tobias of our decision, he didn't take it well. He accused us of being selfish and claimed we were choosing not to attend his wedding just because his biological dad would be there. His words were sharp and dismissive, and I could tell he was upset. He even went so far as to call me dramatic and oversensitive for holding a grudge against Ronnie, as though the years of abuse and trauma I endured at Ronnie's hands should somehow be water under the bridge by now. At that moment, I completely lost control of my emotions. The hurt and frustration that had been building up for so long finally erupted. I couldn't stand it anymore. I told Tobias in no uncertain terms that I was his mother. He had no right to call me dramatic or overly sensitive when he had absolutely no idea what I had endured. I was beyond angry. And for the first time in a long while, I couldn't hold back the pain I had been suppressing. I went to my drawer, pulled out every single document, every piece of evidence from that painful time in my life, the medical records, the pictures from the night Henry was arrested, and the photos of my injuries. I threw those pictures down in front of my son. "Look at what your daddy dearest did to me all those years ago. Do you still think I'm being dramatic now?" I asked him, my voice shaking with emotion. Tobias's face strained of color as he shuffled through the photos of the bruises, the black eyes, the wounds the police had documented that night. I saw the shock in his eyes as the reality of what I had been through, what we both had been through, hit him. For the first time, he looked guilty. I had never shown him this evidence before, as I never thought that he would need to see such things. However, given how dismissive he was being, I wanted him to see the truth. Going through all the pictures, I think he understood that the trauma wasn't just something I had been telling him about. It was real, and it had been painful and terrifying. Henry too had had enough. He stepped in and scolded Tobias, trying to make him understand that while he had every right to invite Ronnie, if he wanted to, he couldn't expect us to participate in that part of his life as we didn't want to. Henry's voice was firm as he told Tobias that we couldn't be forced into being a part of the celebration when I was still not comfortable seeing my abuser at my own son's wedding. In the end, Tobias did mumble an apology to me, but then continued to tell me that he still wanted his father at the wedding as he had already invited Ronnie and didn't want to rescind his invitation. I nodded as I didn't want to argue much further. He then picked up his fangs and left our home quietly. I don't know what will come next. The rift between us feels so deep, so raw that it is hard to see a way forward. I don't regret what I said to Tobias, but I did wish that my son would at least change his mind. Hello. Over the past week, word has spread throughout the family about Henry and I choosing not to attend Tobias' wedding, and we have received countless calls from Henry's relatives who were going to attend the wedding. They were all just as surprised as I was to hear that Ronnie had been invited. Some of them have heard parts of my abuse over the years, and many couldn't understand why Tobias would want to include Ronnie in such an important moment in his life. For my part, I've been completely upfront with everyone who has reached out about the reasons behind our decision to not go to Tobias's wedding. I've told them that the pain from the past, the abuse,